seems like, if you're buying properties that have similar values, you get more out of the 3 property rules than the 200% rule, which would be about 2 properties. Can you explain more why you favor that second approach?
Absolutely. So we're going to talk more about the investment vehicle that I specialize in, the DST. And we can create for an exchanger a diversified portfolio of options where we take $1 million sale and we fracture it over maybe 4 DST properties that they don't have to manage. In that case, there's 4 properties, so we already know that we exceeded the 3 property rule, but now I can identify not only those 4, I can identify another 4 in a backup position, because at $250,000 allocation each, I can identify 8 for that total of $2 million. Does that, I've walked through that pretty quick, but you tracking on that?
I think what you're saying is you're not doing it on a single property, you're doing it on some sort of portfolio. So you're exchanging a full portfolio, and somehow that rule comes.
It could be a portfolio, yeah. I think it'll fall into place a little more when we talk about the DST, but yeah, if you wanted to, so when we sell $1 million property, if you wanted to buy 4 smaller properties that were $250,000 in value, you'd have to use the 200% rule because we've exceeded the 3 property rule in that case. So we can buy down in value. We just have to buy, as you say, kind of a portfolio of assets that allow us to reinvest the full $1 million. Yeah.
Right, but that's only, as you said, if you're targeting properties that have lower value. If you're targeting properties that have equal or higher values than what you're exchanging.
That's right.
Then would you say you would favor in that case the 3 property?
You'd have to use the 3 property rule, yeah, because we'd exceed the 200% in that case. Absolutely.
Do you have to identify these rules? Is there a timeline when you have to identify these rules?
Yeah, the worksheet, every qualified intermediary is going to use their own identification worksheet, and almost all of them, IPX 1031, for example, is a subsidiary of Fidelity National Title. They're a national, publicly traded qualified intermediary. Their form, you check a box. I'm using the 200% rule, or I'm using the 3 property rule, and then you list the properties that you have along with their values aside.
Within that first 45 days?
Correct, yes. You typically submit that on the 44th or the 45th day. Yep. You can change it typically up until the 45th day. So if somebody identifies early and wants to adjust, that's typically allowed. But on the 45th day, once the last version of it goes in, that's your identification sheet, and that's all you can buy. Yep. So we better make sure that we like what's on that list. That can be critical. So here's just kind of a picture bringing everything together, right? So we have our the sale of our relinquished property. The proceeds from that sale go to the qualified intermediary, and our search period begins. We get a 45-day period to identify. We have to close on that purchase within 180 days, and the qualified intermediary is going to be the one that wires your funds to the seller of the property you're purchasing. All right? Getting into the deferral. So we can do a partial exchange. If we sell for $5 million, we can exchange something less than $5 million. But if we target a full tax deferral, we have to make sure that we're not receiving any benefit from the exchange. We can't extract cash, and we can't have any debt relief. So the 2 rules for a full tax deferral are, number 1, we reinvest all the net proceeds, and number 2, we acquire a property with the same or greater debt. That's not fully accurate because we can actually replace debt with new cash, but we'll kind of leave it simple. So those are our 2 rules. We're going to reinvest the net proceeds. We're going to acquire a property with the same or greater debt. So you can see in this first column, we sold a property valued at $5 million. We paid off debt of 2.5 and sales costs of $300K. That left us with net proceeds of $2.2 million. When we went to purchase, we purchased a property at $5.2 million. We took on a little more debt at $3 million, but we reinvested the full 2.2 of our net proceeds. So in this case, we've got no value extracted, we've got no mortgage boot, we've got no cash boot. A full tax deferral should be available to the investor on this exchange. Now let's do a scenario where just working through the numbers on something that doesn't qualify for a full tax deferral. So in this case, we sold the same asset, we have the same 2.2 million in net proceeds, but our replacement property was only 3 million. We took on debt of 2 million and reinvested net equity of 1 million. So you can see we've gotten debt forgiveness or mortgage boot of 500,000, and we've also gotten 1.2 million, excuse me, of cash that we extracted from the exchange because we did not reinvest it. So we're going to be taxed on $1.7 million in most cases in this exchange. So we can do this. This is called a partial exchange. So if we find something that is less in lower value to the property we've sold, this would be considered a partial exchange.
I never knew you could do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
I always put myself in more debt because I didn't know that this was an option.
Yeah, you can do it a partial exchange. Now, the treatment of those gains is typically least favorable first. So that highest depreciation recapture tax rate of 25%, the first dollars out that we have to recognize as gain get taxed at that rate, plus state, plus net investment income tax. So we need to be sure. We'll work with your advisor to make sure you're getting good benefit out of the exchange. Yeah.
What is your ratio between commercial and residential and what you're doing?
So I have a different definition of commercial. I think anything that generates income is commercial property.
Right.
But I think what you mean is zoning classification of
Right.
residential.
Yeah.
The work I do is more commonly residential property because I solve a problem in the investment we're going to talk about to not require people to manage tenants. So often the people managing tenants are attracted to my solution. Commercial property owners are very frequently using 1031 exchanges, but they're not commonly using my replacement property option. Yep. And did you have a question?
I did. So say you sell one property
Mm-hmm.
and you want to buy 3
Okay.
someplace else. Can 2 be paid cash and then the 3rd cover the mortgage piece?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So long as in aggregate, we're satisfying those 2 rules. We're reinvesting the net proceeds and we're replacing the debt. In aggregate, it doesn't matter what the composition or cap stack of each individual property is, but together they have to satisfy those rules. Good question. Yep. This is the tax form that your CPA is going to file. Typical exchanges only use Part 1 and Part 3. Part 2 and 4 are for specific scenarios that aren't very common. So it's a simple form. We're just telling the IRS and the California State Tax Authority that, hey, we did an exchange, we're not going to recognize this gain, we're not going to pay tax on this gain. Just like all tax decisions, we have a self-reported tax system in the United States, so put whatever you want on there and the IRS will come find you and ask you to prove it. I highly recommend you have a CPA that works with you and gives you good, sound, conservative advice, but that's the form they're going to file. So I'm going to end with just some common challenges that we see with exchanges. The first is that exchange equation. So a lot of times people will sell that $1 million property and the only thing they like is the $800,000 property. And they end up with an unintentional partial exchange. So they end up with some tax liability on that boot. Available inventory. So when we're selling a property at a certain price point, and we now have to look basically only in that price point, it restricts our ability to buy certain properties. We're going to look in a very narrow price range. We might have specific requirements around investment performance of that property, around geography, if it's easy to manage. So available inventory can be a problem, and that's why starting early is critical. It leads to missing deadlines. I get calls very frequently on day 40 in the exchange window, and we're like, you know, we need something. Luckily, we have an option that can help in those cases, but you know, this is something we want people starting early, engaging advisors early. It's not a reactive thing, or shouldn't be. closing on the replacement property, this is not uncommon. So if you haven't done due diligence or gotten inspections or gotten disclosures before your ID period ends, you're running a big risk. You're rolling the dice that you're gonna uncover a property defect after your identification window is over. And then financing, so you guys will help with this to make sure clients don't have financing challenges, but that is also a challenge. People buy a property or put something in contract, and then they go to the bank, and the bank isn't excited about lending them. Dan?
When you mentioned missing deadlines, that you had something to work on, you're not talking extension of time.
I don't understand the question.
The 45-day or 180-day, you're not saying that you have ways of extending that time if there's a problem and you haven't.
No, yeah, there are not. There
I
are.
didn't think so.
The IRS in California have issued temporary extensions during COVID, for example. They issued extensions to those timelines, but those are for black swan events.
Right.
Yep. So there's no method to extend under normal circumstances.
So it took a worldwide pandemic for the IRS to move from your deadline?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
got it.
I think. Yeah, I want to say the Palisades fires also impacted the timeline. So there are exceptions, but it's out of the investor's control. So yeah. And then finally, active management. That becomes a big blocker that we help with. We're going to talk more about that. But often people who are selling a property, they're thinking, I'm selling this because I don't want to manage tenants anymore. And if I do an exchange, I get the great benefit of tax deferral, but then I have to manage tenants again. And they're over it at that point. So we'll talk about some solutions to all of these, but that's the end of the 1031 exchange content. Yeah?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
1031. In all of this, what I'm hearing is really, it seems to me, because we are actually looking at this,
Yeah, great.
to research and find the property. And you kind of alluded to it in the earlier part, so my question is just confirmation. To really work on finding that property, do your due diligence, your inspections before, kind of get that subject property set up before you start looking at your selling your relinquished property. Kind of go through
Not
all.
necessarily before. I would be marketing
You're right.
my
Right,
relinquished, yeah.
true.
Yeah, but before it closes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great practice. I lost my thought, Jim. I had a really good
Sorry.
comment here. But yes, absolutely, I would be starting that process early.
Yeah.
So don't be in a position where you're scrambling. And this could be a good safety net for you even in those cases. But, I remember the comment I was going to make, which is we are seeing a lot more reverse exchanges in the last 12 months because things are sitting a little longer. Here in Santa Barbara, for example, the condo market kind of below 1.5, the things people are often borrowing to buy are sitting a little longer. And so people find that replacement property they get excited about first, and it leads to them doing a reverse exchange. So the QIs we work with are reporting a lot higher frequency of reverse exchanges as a result. It costs about $8,000 versus $1,000 to do a reverse exchange. So there's a cost element and there's a complexity element. I would recommend just doing a forward exchange, just time it as best as you can. Yeah. Yeah.
All this is predicated on this concept of like kind. Can you define, what are the parameters of what like kind exchange?
Yeah, so the IRS takes a very broad perspective on like kind. Investment property for investment property. The geographic restrictions are that if we sell a US-based asset, we have to replace it with a US-based asset. We can do an exchange on a foreign property. For some reason, if we sell a foreign property, we have to purchase a foreign property. We can't go domestic to foreign or foreign to domestic. But other than that, there are no geographic restrictions. There are no property type restrictions. We can sell a duplex and buy land. We can sell a Walgreens retail location and purchase a multifamily asset. No restrictions on that.
But you have to hold these in hand. It can be through an entity, or is that different?
So that could impact the same taxpayer rule that we talked about. So if we own the relinquished asset in an entity or in a partnership, we usually have to match the replacement property purchase in the same way. We can.
What does that mean? You have to match.
So-
You have to own the replacement property in an entity as well.
Yeah, so if, for example,
I'm sorry.
Ryan, no problem,
I
man.
gotta go take care of a client before this open, but.
absolutely. Ryan, good to meet you,
Doing a
man.
great job.
Look me up, dude.
Everyone.
We'll go grab coffee sometime.
Okay.
Thank you so much, appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah, so if we own, let's say we own a relinquished property with an LLC, it files its own tax return because there's more than one member to the LLC. So if it's a one-member LLC, it's usually disregarded for tax purposes. So if we have two members, it has an EIN and it files its own tax return. The LLC is the taxpayer. The LLC is selling the property, and in exchange, the LLC has to buy the property.
Right. It can't be with, you as an individual can't do this where you exchange, you sell your ownership into one LLC to buy ownership
Correct.
in different real estate
Because
projects.
what the IRS thinks you own, Alex, in that case, is not property. The IRS thinks you own interests in an LLC.
Which is correct. But,
Right.
Yeah.
So you can't do an exchange, but the LLC owns property, it can do an exchange. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The DST is kind of an exception to that rule, in a way, because it's going to satisfy some of what you're talking about. It's a structure born out of that exact question. Before I move on to it though, yeah,
And maybe the DST will answer this, and we can take it later because I really want to move on to that. But what if the property is held in a trust?
the trust usually, if it's a revocable living trust,
Yes.
it's usually a disregarded entity, right? It's a grantor trust.
Right.
So the trust itself is not the owner.
True.
The individual is the tax owner. The beneficial owner is the individual who's the trustee of the trust.
So no implications tax-wise?
No,
Yeah.
I would recommend if you have a trust, you have it for a reason, right? It's an
Yeah.
important estate planning tool, so I would recommend you keep the replacement property in the trust.
Of course.
But technically speaking, we'd have to get an attorney to confirm this, but I don't think that would matter because the tax owner is the
Still the
individual.
individual.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
That was very close to being legal advice. That is
I understand.
that is
I
my
understand.
conceptual opinion on
I
that.
understand.
Yeah.
You had mentioned clients that are kind of done with tenants. Would you say that usually is people who are getting closer to retirement age?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is, and it's skewing younger now because in Santa Barbara City, we just passed the rent freeze.
Right.
So now it's not just that people want to retire from tenants, it's they're tired of the regulatory environment.
Right.
So now we're getting people of all ages that are like, I'm just done.
Tired of California.
Tired of California. Yeah,
Right.
truthfully.
Okay.
But that's the problem we're actually looking to solve with the DST, the Delaware Statutory Trust. Before I move on to that here, a time check, I went long on the exchange stuff. Can I go
Yeah.
another 15 minutes?
They'll be at around 12, and if you don't mind talking while they're kind of taking orders, that's fine too.
Okay, I'll go quick and you guys tell me if this is or isn't important to you, we can anchor down. But there are two ways, so we talked a lot about these entity or partnership style exchanges. There are two entities where the individual who owns a fraction of the property is allowed to exchange as an individual. So even though in the DST and the TIC, the Delaware Statutory Trust and the Tenancy in Common, we can act like a limited partner in this investment, but our individual fractional ownership is exchangeable. So we can enter and exit this partnership format, this partnership-like format as an individual. The big differences between these two are that the DST can have up to 500 investors. The TIC is limited to 35. In the DST, the management is handled entirely by the sponsor, is the professional operating company that's asset managing for us. In a TIC, the investors vote on asset management decisions. And then finally, financing a TIC is a lot more challenging. The individual investors are typically underwritten directly, whereas in a DST, the property is the only thing securing the loan, so it's fully non-recourse to the investors of the DST. So this is just to highlight kind of the trends of capital flows. So the DST has been around since 2004, so it's a little over 20 years. It was created specifically for 1031 exchange investors to simplify the exchange and give people a passive ownership option. Last year, we did about $8.4 billion of equity into this structure. Anybody want to guess what state contributed the most to that $8.4 billion? What California? 36% of that number came from California property owners that are tired of having and managing property here in California. So you can see that the marketplace is, that 8.4 billion was spread across 255 different properties. So each DST contains typically one property. You're buying that one property. So 255 were available across 68 different operators or sponsors. The types of properties that you see in these structures, they're all going to be institutional quality commercial assets. Most commonly industrial and multifamily. In fact, it was multifamily was the top asset class every year until about 2 years ago, and we had a little change to the structure. So now industrial is becoming popular. But we also have senior housing, student housing, storage, hospitality, office, medical. So we have just about every flavor or asset class of commercial property, multifamily and industrial, the top two. A couple of the highlights here. So with the DST, you are investing. It simplifies the exchange, but you're not managing anything. The property is managed by a professional manager. Some of these companies have been around more than 50 years, and all they do is asset manage and acquire commercial properties. So it's institutional quality assets. The debt, as we talked about, is always non-recourse. The nice thing is the DST is fully packaged for us. We have, and once the property is acquired, the trust is created, the sponsor goes to the market with the opportunity for investors to invest in it. We have a team of about 5 people on our due diligence staff that reviews the offering. They pull out about 150 different data points on the property, on the market, on the sponsor, and then we go through an investment committee review. Once it's approved at investment committee, it goes on my list. And I've got a list of anywhere from 15 to 20 options at all times. So if an exchanger calls me on day 44, I can present to them based on their investment objectives and their risk tolerance and their desire for income characteristics. I can present them options on that list that have already been reviewed and approved, and they can invest in within days. So that's the fully packaged element is a huge catch-all and kind of a safety net for investors that are losing days in their ID window. We can also create a diversified portfolio. So we custom build this for an investor. If they have a large investment in a piece of real estate, they may sell that, and we can diversify that, as I said, over multiple different properties. And now we've created some diversification of both property type, sponsor, and geography. And then finally, when we go through an exchange, there's often this exacting of how much can I spend, how much is going to be available for closing costs. We eliminate all of that when in a DST, because if you have $1 million sitting in your exchange account, we invest $1 million into DSTs. As long as the equity is unsold in the DST property, you can purchase that amount. So you can pick it down to the penny what you want to invest. I'm a financial advisor, so I got to talk about the bad stuff too, and this is just a short list of the most important things to be considerate of. The first is that the investor in this structure does not have any control. So we are trusting the asset manager, the sponsor, to make our decisions around day-to-day management, around when the property is sold. And until the property is sold, the investment is considered illiquid. So 5 to 10 year holding period is pretty common. We can transfer, in most cases, those beneficial interests that represent our ownership. We can transfer those in a direct transaction, but there's no marketplace to do that. So we encourage an investor who's considering a DST to be prepared to own the property up to 10 years. There are fees involved and they're built into the structure, so the sponsor and sales offices need to collect a fee. And then finally, these are still real estate investments. So We get a lot of referrals from people, and they come to us saying, oh, these are high risk or guaranteed income investments, right? Wrong. This is real estate. So you're still owning real estate. You're subject to economic risks, occupancy dips, rent fall. So important to note that we're still buying real estate here. So these are the most common ways to use it. The first is as a primary replacement. This is why we're seeing a lot of California owners choose this. It's because they just want passive ownership. They're just tired, they want to retire from managing real estate. Yeah, Dan?
And you're actually locating the properties and bringing them into these investments.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. So that's the number one reason to choose this. The second is estate simplification. So if somebody is later in life and they're thinking about, I've got this commercial or mixed use property and my kids aren't going to want to manage it, they're not going to know who's going to manage it or who's going to decide who's going to sell it, we can strip all of those decisions from the estate and move them through a 1031 exchange into DST ownership. And the re-registration of ownership after they pass is very simple. It's just put 25% in child one, put 25% in child two. It takes all that stress away from the next generation. And then finally, somebody may just want to get out of California ownership, and their options are, okay, I could sell my property here and buy a duplex in Arizona, but I don't want to fly to Arizona to manage this thing. Well, here's a way you can pivot out of a geography or a property type and not have to manage. The next is, the way we see it used is as a complementary option. So if we sell that $1 million property, and the only thing we like is the $800,000 property, we can use the DST to complement and just invest the $200,000 that we have left and give ourselves a full tax deferral. So that's the complementary way. A backup identification. So this is where we're on day 44. We found 2 properties we like, but neither of them are under contract. In that case, let's definitely put a DST as your third option. If you find property defects on property 1 and property 2, you have the DST available to you to complete the exchange into. So that's a simple backup ID. So even if you're considering an exchange and you have no interest in DSTs, I want you to know about them because in the complementary or backup ID situation, there's still an important use in the exchange. And then finally, the immediate identification. This is where we're late stage ID window and we just need something now. Okay, so that's DST intro. I'm going to give you 2 quick case studies here. This is just kind of bringing this to life a little bit more. So these are kind of typical garden variety DST options. So on the left, we've got the first DST. It's a 250 unit Class A multifamily. These are usually newer vintage assets, means they are newer constructed assets. Often they're bought directly from the developer, but they're usually stabilized occupancy, so over 90%. In this one, it was acquired for $80 million, but there's $40 million of debt, $40 million of equity that's available. So that's a 50% loan to value on the property. And the sponsor is projecting 4.5% distributions on the equity that you invest. The second example DST is an industrial offering. So this is an Amazon last mile or fulfillment center. In this case, it was acquired for $100 million with all cash. So there's no debt on this. It's projecting a 5% year 1 distribution. So these are the 2 DSTs we have available, and we have now a scenario where someone's going through an exchange. In this case, the scenario is the investor sold a rental property for $2 million, and they had a $500,000 loan balance. So they're retiring about a 25% loan to value. That leaves them with $1.5 million in sales proceeds. We're ignoring cost of sale here, all right? We're going to assume a very efficient sale. So they want to use this as a primary replacement option. So what can we do in this scenario? Well, we can simply just fracture that $1.5 million across the 2 DSTs. So in the first DST, we have 50% loan to value. That's a, Dan, you all right? We've got a 50% loan to value, so that means it's 1-to-1 debt to equity. So for every dollar we invest in DST1, we get credited in the exchange with $1 of debt. So the closing statement on DST1 is going to show $750,000 of proceeds invested, $750,000 worth of debt credited, for a total real estate purchase of $1.5 million. And then they're going to put the other $750,000 in DST number 2. That's all cash, so they have a closing statement there that just shows the $750,000. But in combination between DST1 and DST2, they've purchased $2.25 million worth of real estate.